Good evening, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to all of you, both physically present here at CTU and those who are joining us remotely. I am Sister Barbara Reed, President of Catholic Theological Union, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program on the consistent ethic of life in light of Fratelli Tutti. If you're new to CTU, allow me to describe for a moment who we are. Catholic Theological Union was formed in 1968 when three men's religious communities, the Passionists, Franciscans, and Servites, joined efforts to respond to the call to rethink seminary education in the wake of Vatican II. And so CTU was founded in this urban context close to the University of Chicago and other schools of theology, where we could easily engage in ecumenical, intercultural, and interreligious exchanges. Today, the seminarians and brother religious from 23 men's religious communities that are the corporate owners of the school make up about 40% of our student body, and about 20% are women religious, and the other 40% are lay women and men who are preparing for a great variety of ministries in the church. Our mission is to prepare effective leaders for the church, ready to witness to Christ's good news of justice, love, and peace. Tonight's program is sponsored by CTU's Bernardin Center, which was established 26 years ago with the blessing of Cardinal Joseph Bernardin of blessed memory, to continue the work that was so dear to his heart: reconciliation, peacemaking, dialogue, cultivation of church leadership, the pursuit of common ground, and affirming a consistent ethic of life. We are so pleased that tonight Cardinal Michael Czerny is with us to speak on the consistent ethic of life in light of Fratelli Tutti. We are very pleased that Cardinal Cupich has also planned to join us this evening, and I now invite Steve Millies, Director of the Bernardin Center, to introduce Cardinal Czerny.
Thank you, Sister Barbara. And I should say, thanking Sister Barbara, I thank very briefly the whole CTU community that it takes to put an event like this together. Administration, faculty, staff, students, formators, everyone. Many of you have helped us. I thank you very much. I am Steve Millies, a member of the faculty and director of the Bernardin Center. On October 9th, 1996, what turned out to be 36 days before he died, Cardinal Joseph Bernardin, as Sister Barbara said, asked Catholic Theological Union to create a Bernardin Center that would continue his legacy and ecclesial vision. For 25 years, 26 years, in fact, we've done that. But Cardinal Bernardin was also specific in one particular. He asked us at CTU in the Bernardin Center to continue to develop the consistent ethic of life. So we have, and so we do. And I can think of no greater way to honor that request at this particular time and in this moment than the way we'll do it tonight. For that reason, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. If you've seen the worship aid with his short biography inside, you can get some sense of the scale of our speaker's lifelong commitment to going immediately to where help is needed, seeking out, as Pope Francis reminds us in Fratelli Tutti, those left by the roadside. Today, Pope Francis has asked him in the work of the Dicastery he leads to do that work on a global scale on behalf of everyone at the margins, but most especially with respect to migrants, people taking desperate action to seek safety and a better life, and people, I should add, we all in the United States must be mindful about, asking how we can help them this weekend particularly. I won't repeat what you already have in your programs. Instead, I want to say very simply what an honor it is for Catholic Theological Union to welcome back to Hyde Park, so near his alma mater at the other end of 55th Street, the University of Chicago, the prefect for the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, Cardinal Michael Czerny of the Society of Jesus, whom I invite now to offer his thoughts about a seamless ethic for siblings all, the hope of Fratelli Tutti. Cardinal Czerny, thank you.
Thank you. Dear friends, this evening's lecture honors Chicago's Cardinal Joseph Bernardin, a visionary leader who died a quarter of a century ago. Catholic social doctrine, he wrote, is based on two inseparable truths about the human person. I quote, "Human life is both sacred and social. Because we esteem human life as sacred, we have a duty to protect and foster it at all stages of development, from conception to death, and in all circumstances. Because we acknowledge that human life is also social, we must develop the kind of social environment that protects and fosters its development." Appreciating the wisdom and relevance of this teaching, we continue his legacy. His second successor as Archbishop of Chicago, Cardinal Blaise Cupich, has enriched Bernardin's ethical teaching with this explicit emphasis. The Church is calling for a consistent ethic of solidarity that aims at making sure no one, from the first moment of life to natural death, from the wealthiest community to our poorest neighborhoods, is excluded from the table of life. Our Church teaches that promoting the development of human life, meaning in the fullest sense the flourishing of human life in salvation history, must be a multifaceted mission that protects and enhances life's sacredness, its solidarity in which we are all siblings, sibling offspring of God, and its caring nurture of our common home. We call this integral human development, the name of the Vatican's Dicastery where I serve. Please note, there are several related and even synonymous terms at work here: sacred, seamless, social, solidarity, consistent, inclusive, integral. Let these terms help us to pay closer attention, to open our minds and hearts, to broaden our horizons, to move us towards various relevant frontiers. Taking Fratelli Tutti as our primary text of reference, let us imagine Pope Francis joining us this evening to render our Church's pastoral action, solidarity, and ethics as inclusive as creation and redemption. I will share with you my subtitles so that you get a little less lost. The first subtitle, From the Start, Expert in Humanity. The book of Job sees our origin in the one Creator as the basis of certain common rights. Did not God, who made me in the womb, also make the slave? And did not the same God fashion us both in the womb? Jesus said, I came so that they might have life and have it more abundantly. And then St. John reflected, see what love the Father has bestowed on us, that we may be called children of God. Yet so we are. From the Gospels, from the Apostles, from the early writings of the Church Fathers to today's encyclicals and exhortations, the Church's moral and social doctrine has consistently maintained and promoted a correct understanding of the human person. It begins with fully acknowledging that we are created by God. We are children of God. In the Gospels, when he gives us the Lord's Prayer, Christ instructs us to address God with the familial word Abba, a word even more intimate and informal than our word Father, more like Daddy. The Sermon on the Mount encourages us to regard each other as children of God. The Acts of the Apostles depicts the community of first Christians as sibling believers in a family wherein all was shared according to need. St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians continues in this vein, describing us as siblings in the family of God, united as a mystical body. In the teachings of the early church fathers and doctors of the church, this same conception of the human person is reiterated again and again. And the recent document on human fraternity, which was signed in 2019 and which was reaffirmed formally in Kazakhstan just this past week, this important document on human fraternity opens with these words: "In the name of God, who has created all human beings equal in rights, duties, and dignity, and who has called them to live together as brothers and sisters, to fill the earth and make known the values of goodness, love, and peace." So this is now a common statement of many religions. So we are born not in isolation, but as siblings in God's family, not as self-sufficient, but with gifts and obligations, called to care and share, but also free to sin, members of a human family, and indeed a mystical body. A flawed and deteriorating anthropology. Tragically, unjustly, and acting contrary to life, the momentum of our age is against integral human development, against our divinely appointed role to care for our common home, against the sacredness of human life, against human solidarity. At its core, many of the contradictions that our present age poses for integral human development turn on erroneous understandings of the human person, flawed anthropology. And for 130 years, Catholic social teaching has been trying to correct this flawed anthropology. Let's go back to the beginning. In the first social encyclical, Rerum Novarum, written in 1891, Pope Leo XIII referred to the various classes of society, foreseeing their being united in the bonds of friendship, but also in those of brotherly love, a clear anticipation of Fratelli Tutti. And he goes on, "They will understand and feel," I will not change the language so you hear what he said, "they will understand and feel that all men are children of the same common Father, who is God, that all have alike the same last end, which is God himself, who alone can make either men or angels absolutely and perfectly happy, that each and all are redeemed and made sons of God by Jesus Christ, the firstborn among many brethren, that the blessings of nature and the gifts of grace belong to the whole human race in common, and that from none, except the unworthy, is withheld the inheritance of the kingdom of heaven." Thus far, Leo XIII. In 1931, in his encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, Pope Pius XI called this corrupted understanding of the human person a poisoned spring. He meant the idea, associated with libertarians at that time and with today's neoliberals, that the right ordering of economic life should be left to free market competition. For Pope Pius, this represented, and I quote, "an evil individualistic spirit." In 1967, Pope St. Paul VI similarly addressed the problematic in his encyclical Populorum Progressio, and even more directly in his 1971 apostolic letter, Octogesium Adveniens, where he recalled that at the very root of philosophical liberalism is an erroneous affirmation of the autonomy of the individual in his activity, his motivation, and the exercise of his liberty. while exalting economic efficiency to the point of dominating all other values, individual autonomy was attractive at that time as a defense against totalitarian tendencies. Pope St. John Paul II made the crucial point that while private property is legitimate and valid, the right to it must always be subordinated to the universal destination of goods, the notion that the goods of the earth are given by God to all persons. Pope John Paul II refers to this as a social mortgage. He goes on, it is necessary to state once more the characteristic principle of Christian social doctrine, namely, the goods of this world are originally meant for all. The right to private property is valid and necessary, but it does not nullify the value of this principle. Private property, in fact, is under a social mortgage, which means that it has an intrinsically social function, based upon and justified precisely by the principle of the universal destination of goods. And indeed, in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis returns to this theme, arguing that the right to private property should be considered a secondary natural right subordinated to the universal destination of goods. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI also contributed to our understanding of Catholic social teaching. He worried about the effects of globalization on human bonds. He said, as society becomes ever more globalized, it makes us neighbors, but does not make us brothers and sisters. Neighbors, but not brothers and sisters. He goes on to list some of the concrete problems of globalization. And this is a long quote from Benedict. The global market has stimulated first and foremost, on the part of rich countries, a search for areas in which to outsource production at low cost with a view to reducing the prices of many goods, increasing purchasing power, and thus accelerating the rate of development in terms of greater availability of consumer goods for the domestic market. Consequently, the market has prompted new forms of competition between states as they seek to attract foreign businesses to set up production centers by means of a variety of instruments, including favorable fiscal regimes and deregulation of the labor market, the unprotection of workers, in other words. These processes have led to a downsizing of social security systems as the price to be paid for seeking greater competitive advantage in the global market, with consequent grave danger for the rights of workers, for fundamental human rights, and for the solidarity associated with the traditional forms of the social state. My dear friends, we have reached the end of the first third, just so that you can pace yourself. And to celebrate this road mark, you now have 2 minutes to relax with each other and breathe while I take a drink of water. And you feel free to chat. I should have apologized to the online participants for not being able to offer them a chance to chat unless they're watching this together. So the next part starts with good anthropology comes first. The same concern with correcting a flawed anthropology infuses Fratelli Tutti. The title of Chapter 3, Envisaging and Engendering an Open World, expresses one goal of the encyclical's thinking, The starting point is this anthropological affirmation that quotes Gaudium et Spes. Human beings are so made that they cannot live, develop, and find fulfillment except in the sincere gift of self to others. These words from Gaudium et Spes, comments John Paul II, can be said to sum up the whole of Christian anthropology, that theory and practice based on the Gospels in which we discover ourselves as belonging to Christ and discover that in Christ we are raised to the status of children of God, and so better understand our own dignity as human beings, precisely because we are the subject of God's approach and presence, the subject of the divine condescension, which contains the prospect and the very root of definitive glorification. Fratelli Tutti goes on to explain how the gift of self is the path to fullness. It says, nor can they fully, speaking about us, nor can they fully know themselves apart from an encounter with other persons. Quote, I communicate effectively with myself only insofar as I communicate with others. No one can experience the true beauty of life without relating to others, without having real faces to love. This is part of the mystery of authentic human existence. Life exists where there is bonding, communion, fraternity, and life is stronger than death when it is built on true relationships and bonds of fidelity. On the contrary, there is no life when we claim to be self-sufficient and live as islands. In these attitudes, death prevails. Authentic human development concerns the whole of the person in every single dimension, including the transcendent dimension, and the person cannot be sacrificed for the sake of attaining a particular good, whether this so-called good be economic or social, individual or collective. For Pope Francis, self-giving, the continuous giving of self, is what grounds and orients integral human development. When does a person fully experience his or her dignity as a creature loved by God and acknowledged by humankind? This happens when a person reaches the existential point of freely and consciously opting for the gift of self to others. This depends not only upon external conditions, the right to food, housing, work, healthcare, education, social services, and so on. It depends also on inner ones, personal maturity, always seeking to get beyond narcissistic self-centeredness. Because our present age militates against this Christian understanding of the human person, it therefore also fails to promote authentic, integral human development, and instead pushes so many fake models, so many deformations. Pope Francis takes aim at the ideology in which self-interest and indifference are not only tolerated, but justified and even imposed, in which solidarity is sidelined as optional, and where the common good is reduced to an abstraction. To counter these tendencies, it is urgent for the Church to proclaim to me and to each one of us that it is in making a gift of myself to others that the meaning of all that I am is at stake and becomes real. A new section with my favorite title, and it's a quote from Evangelii Gaudium. It is irksome when the question of ethics is raised. I'm glad you agree with me. In 2009, in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict correctly interpreted the global financial crisis, and we're still living with its fallout, as a crisis of ethics. 4 years later, a few months after becoming Pope, in his Evangelii Gaudium, Francis robustly rejected the neoliberal claim that the free market alone can foster human flourishing. And I quote, "In this context, some people continue to defend trickle-down theories which assume that economic growth, encouraged by a free market, will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting. To sustain a lifestyle which excludes others, or to sustain enthusiasm for that selfish ideal, a globalization of indifference has developed. Almost without being aware of it, we end up being incapable of feeling compassion at the outcry of the poor, of weeping for other people's pain, and of feeling a need to help them, as though all this were someone else's responsibility and not our own. The culture of prosperity deadens us. We are thrilled if the market offers us something new to purchase. In the meantime, all those lives stunted for lack of opportunity seem a mere spectacle. They fail to move us." In Laudato Si, Pope Francis condemns a culture of relativism which drives one person to take advantage of another, to treat others as mere objects. He's deeply concerned with what he calls integral ecology, the idea that how we treat nature and how we treat our fellow human beings are interconnected. Here's what he says about this culture of relativism. "It is also the mindset of those who say, let us allow the invisible forces of the market to regulate the economy and consider their impact on society and on nature as collateral damage." Soon after, in possibly some of his strongest remarks delivered on the global economy, in a speech to popular movements in Bolivia in 2015, Pope Francis denounced the current economic system. "The first task is to put the economy at the service of people," he says. "Human beings and nature must not be at the service of money. Let us say no to an economy of exclusion and inequality where money rules rather than service. That economy kills. That economy excludes. That economy destroys Mother Earth." This is a strong indictment. And once again, this exclusionary stance comes from a flawed anthropology. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis criticizes this disordered anthropology of individualism, which leads to a distortion of the idea of liberty. Liberty becomes nothing more than a condition for living as we will, completely free to choose to whom or what we will belong, to whom or to what we will belong, or simply to possess or exploit. This shallow understanding has little to do with the richness of a liberty directed above all to love. Liberty to love. Moreover, individualism does not make us more free or more equal or more fraternal. The mere sum of individual interests is not capable of generating a better world for the whole human family. Taking direct aim at the neoliberal ideology, though I think he was pretty much on target already, Francis declares, "The marketplace by itself cannot resolve every problem, however much we are asked to believe this dogma of neoliberal faith. Whatever the challenge, this impoverished and repetitive school of thought always offers the same recipes. Neoliberalism simply reproduces itself by resorting to the magic theories of spillover or trickle down, without using the name, as the only solution to societal problems. There's little appreciation of the fact that the alleged spillover does not resolve the inequality that gives rise to the new forms of violence threatening the fabric of society. Succinctly bringing together all the dimensions, the right, and here I quote again, the right of some to free enterprise or market freedom cannot supersede the rights of peoples and the dignity of the poor, or, for that matter, respect for the natural environment. For if we make something our own, it is only to administer it for the good of all. Now, illustrating a consistent ethic for tomorrow. The biblical ideal of the seamless garment goes back to the Catholic pacifist Eileen Egan in 1971. And nearly 40 years ago, Cardinal Bernardin began making the expression and related idea of a consistent life ethic more widely known and accepted. I would like to draw out this theme to further elaborate the Church's teaching on economics. In so doing, I hope to give support to Bernardin's profound insight that the Church's teachings on human life and social life are interconnected in the Christian mission of integral human development and in the Christian vision of Fratelli Tutti. Since Rerum Novarum of 1891, for over 130 years, the Church has expressed support for the market economy on two conditions, that it be properly regulated and that its protagonists be guided by appropriate values and virtues. The Church teaches that a market economy requires participants who have been formed in virtue. In addition, the Church teaches that markets need to be directed by legitimate authority towards universal public goods and towards the common good of all. As noted earlier, it cannot be left to the free competition of forces. It cannot be dominated by the flawed anthropology of libertarianism and neoliberalism. Especially in response to the 2008 financial crisis, the Church has observed that markets lack intrinsic means to modulate their operation for public goods, such as care for the environment, promotion of public health, or preferencing distributive justice for those in poverty. Nor are economic markets able in themselves to respect principles of morality. If suppliers are willing to sell and consumers are willing to buy, then anything can be traded. And human trafficking is just one horrible example. So, the Church consistently and repeatedly denounces market economies when their excesses result in neglecting the needs and diminishing the lives of significant majorities, leaving them vulnerable, marginalized, and impoverished. As Pope Benedict explained in Caritas in Veritate, economic activity cannot solve all social problems through the simple application of commercial logic. This needs to be directed towards the pursuit of the common good, for which the political community in particular must also take responsibility. Therefore, it must be borne in mind that grave imbalances are produced when economic action, conceived merely as an engine for wealth creation, is detached from political action, conceived as a means for pursuing justice through redistribution. Theoretically, the global market economy should be a coming together of sellers and buyers in which production provides goods and services to be purchased by individualized consumers for their needs and wants. Free market advocates insist that if the market is truly free, then by the logic of competition, it yields the most efficient outcome, the highest quality, and the greatest satisfaction of consumer demand. Of course, no perfectly free market has ever existed. Producers and sellers organize in cartels and corporations to manipulate supply and prices. The state and other outside powers intervene for reasons both noble and self-interested. Indeed, the market is always subject to the rules laid down by society and politics, whether we're talking about libertarianism with its emphasis on property rights or social democracy, which elevates economic rights. There is always a directing principle. Regardless of their degree of freedom, however, economic markets powerfully shape the choices and the character of those who participate in their operation. In fact, market operations can create conditions of moral relativism. As I already noted, Pope Francis raises the specter of the culture of relativism when in Laudato Si he sees it as the same disorder which drives one person to take advantage of another, to treat others as mere objects, imposing forced labor on them or enslaving them to pay their debts. It is, furthermore, the mindset of those who say, let us allow the invisible forces of the market to regulate the economy and consider their impact on society and nature as collateral damage. In the absence of objective truths or sound principles, other than the satisfaction of our own desires and immediate needs, what limits can be placed on human trafficking, organized crime, the drug trade, commerce in blood diamonds, and the fur of endangered species? The market mindset shapes how human beings understand themselves, their perception of values, their worldview. And it does so facelessly and automatically. A favorite example of mine is bottled water. Example. Years ago, an expert in this field showed me how problematic bottled water is. Bottled water puts a price on what should be readily available. In many parts of the world, beer is cheaper and cleaner than water. This can have a social cost because of domestic violence and other complications. Discarded plastic bottles are a significant source of environmental degradation. Bottled water also de-incentivizes governments from providing clean drinking water. For municipally provided water from a tap, defined as a public service, needs to meet higher standards of purity than water sold as a food item. How can the majority of us be manipulated into spending money on an item sold in an environmentally damaging container when what's delivered to our homes is or should be purer and much cheaper? It is nothing short of astonishing. With this show and tell, we have happily reached the end of the second third. And so you guys have earned another break. The advertising worked. Okay, I apologize to our sponsors for that unmerited attack, but well, not unmerited, but innocent attack. The next section is called Challenges on a Global Scale, as if we were talking about little things until now. Let us now briefly examine how our global economy promotes the viruses of materialism and consumerism across the world stage. Because its invisible hands inexorably promote what sells over anything that does not sell, The global economy often makes it difficult, even for well-meaning participants, to choose what might be better for the common good, better for the impoverished among us, better to care for the environment. In other words, morally better. The anthropology promoted in the economic sphere is that of Homo economicus. It conceives of the human person as individualized and competitively driven to maximize material self-interest and to look at the world simply as a mere collection of objects to be bought and sold. Even other human beings can be objectified for self-interest or else viewed merely as competitors to be overcome. Seen in this guise, the human being becomes not a beloved creation of God, but simply another tool or resource in the market economy. Fratelli Tutti warns that the enormous power of our global economy works to separate us from solidarity with others. The economy unifies the world, but divides persons and nations. We are more alone than ever in an increasingly massified world that promotes individual interests and weakens the communitarian dimension of life. Indeed, there are markets where individuals become mere consumers or bystanders. In light of the enormities of the global economy and driven by that economy to focus on material self-interest and to see others as competitors, the human person feels isolated and vulnerable. Alone against the vast forces of the global economy, we feel weak and at risk. Indeed, we can experience this as a profound alienation and fear for ourselves. And of course, for the poor, those whom the economy fails, they are seen as the lazy and the losers, further adding to their isolation and defeatedness. Alienation and fear unleash a downward spiral that some might seek to resolve by seeing the world as a confrontation of us versus them. Ancient conflicts, thought long buried, are breaking out anew, while instances of a myopic, extremist, resentful, and aggressive nationalism are on the rise. In some countries, a concept of popular and national unity influenced by various ideologies is creating new forms of selfishness and a loss of the social sense under the guise of defending national interests. As we know from past centuries and the current one, many can be led to resolve their alienation and fear via submission to leaders who feed on resentment or promise retribution. Why does it seem more and more difficult for our church to teach effectively about the human person? Why does a flawed conception seem to entrench itself deeper and deeper in the structures of modern life? And where else do we see it manifest besides flawed economics? A longer discussion could certainly examine the technocratic paradigm, which Francis castigates in Laudato Si for its distortion of the essential human character, and perhaps also the perverse dynamics of mass society spawned by aberrations of mass social media. But these questions we leave untouched for today. Instead, we pass to the next section, the consistent ethics of life and solidarity. To sum up so far, the functioning of the global market economy tends more and more to objectify the human person, isolate the human person in fragile and fearful individualism, and prioritize self-interests over the common good. All of this is fundamentally at odds with the sanctity and dignity of life, of human life, of all life. Let me make use then of the See, Judge, Act methodology that has become widespread in Catholic social analysis. First, understand the issues with their multifaceted complexity. Next, affirm a resolution consistent with values and principles. And finally, identify concrete paths forward to commit to. Some seem to connect the idea of a consistent ethic of life and solidarity exclusively with the biological life from conception to natural death, as if this were part of the Church's moral doctrine. To limit our understanding of the consistent ethic of life to mere bodily human life, however, is a worrisome reduction of the full richness of the Church's teaching on the sanctity and dignity of human life. Consider, for example, how the global economy results in sweeping inequalities for life and for opportunities to live with dignity. Do not the shorter lifespans and higher infant mortalities of those in poverty cry to heaven for justice and mercy in the same way that deaths of unborn do? Are not the indignities and mistreatment of the lives of those marginalized and oppressed by the invisible hands of the market also contrary to what we should perceive as the consistent ethic of life? Fratelli Tutti speaks of the unregulated market's anti-life attitude as throwing away or discarding others. This way of discarding others can take a variety of forms, such as an obsession with reducing labor costs with no concern for its grave consequences, since the unemployment that it directly generates leads to the expansion of poverty. In addition, a readiness to discard others finds expression in vicious attitudes that we thought long past, such as racism, which retreats underground only to keep re-emerging. Nor can mere toleration ever be enough, leading, as it inevitably does, to a pernicious relativism. Under the guise of tolerance, relativism ultimately leaves the interpretation of moral values to those in power to be defined as they see fit, in the absence of objective truths or sound principles other than the satisfaction of our own desires and immediate needs. We should not think that political efforts or the force of law will be sufficient. When the culture itself is corrupt and objective truth and universally valid principles are no longer upheld, then laws can only be seen as arbitrary impositions or obstacles to be avoided. A larger picture of what it means to be pro-life, of what we should understand to be the consistent ethic of life, begins to become clearer. It is certainly not enough to simply oppose abortion and euthanasia, nor is it enough to recognize and tolerate the dignity of the lives of all, even with special tolerance for those who, unlike us, are marginalized or poor. No, Christ's garment is truly seamless and whole. The genuinely pro-life also requires accompanying, welcoming, and joining together with others as sibling children of God, especially those who, because of their differences, are hardest for us to love. So, as we began, a consistent ethic of life is also a consistent ethic of solidarity. You will be happy to hear that that this next section is called Fratelli Tutti and Conclusion. The contemporary world, as we have considered it this evening, is at odds with the ethic of solidarity that is so essential in the Christian conception of the human person. In militating against solidarity, moreover, the processes of the contemporary world also militate against the ethic of life. Our age's dynamics, seen in the global economy, promote a radical but also a fragile and fearful individualism that impels us to look upon others, not as our siblings under God, but as others whose differences must be spurned, as competitors to be dominated, as objects for our use, and as potential threats to be feared. It is little wonder, as Fratelli Tutti puts it, that ancient conflicts, long thought buried, are breaking out anew, and myopic, extremist, resentful, and aggressive nationalism and new forms of selfishness and a loss of the social sense are burgeoning around us. If we accept the great principle that there are rights born of our inalienable human dignity, we can rise to the challenge of envisaging a new humanity. We can aspire, and this is the message of Fratelli Tutti, we can aspire to a world that provides land, housing, and work for all. These are the 3 T's that we have learned from the popular movements in Latin America: techo, trabajo, y tierra. This is the true path of peace, not the senseless and myopic strategy of sowing fear and mistrust in the face of outside threats. For a real and lasting peace will only be possible on the basis of a global ethic of solidarity and cooperation in the service of a future shaped by interdependence and shared responsibility in the whole human family. Pope Francis builds towards this global ethic from the most local level, the Good Samaritan's encounter that answers the question, who is my neighbor? The Samaritan not only sets aside his personal priorities, he even helps someone whom his community sees as an enemy. This is the summit of solidarity, of treating the other as thou, as you, as person. The parable reminds us of an essential and often forgotten aspect of our common humanity. We were created for a fulfillment that can only be found in love. We cannot allow anyone to go through life as an outcast. My dear brothers and sisters, recognizing each other as the sibling offspring of God that we are, let us come together in solidarity and social friendship to rebuild this broken world, our only home, this human race, our one and only family under God. And thank you.
And if I could invite you, after you've refreshed yourself a little bit, I know we have an audience here that I suspect may be filled with questions. If you wouldn't mind answering a few, we have some student volunteers with handheld microphones. And so if you wouldn't mind selecting, would you like to select questioners? All right, I shall select questioners. And we'll give you an opportunity to enter into dialogue with some of the folks who've come out here to join us tonight. Are there questions? It's always a challenge to find the first one. In the back.
Should I just start?
Go right ahead, please.
I'm Laurie Brink. The question I have, what's the intersection between Laudato Si and this document? Laudato Si is very clearly advocating for our common home. How do we stay in solidarity with the human race and remain in solidarity with our common home?
Let me not answer that question by giving a very good answer that I prepared. There are 3 great documents: Evangelii Gaudium, Laudato Si, and Fratelli Tutti. Evangelii Gaudium answers the question, who? And the answer is an evangelizing church. Who? If the church is not evangelizing, there's nothing to teach, there's nothing to say. Let's just give up. So Evangelii Gaudium answers the question, who? Laudato Si answers the question, what? What do we need to do? Well, basically we need to care for our common home. If we don't care for our common home, as we're discovering, unfortunately, day by day, we are frit, not to use a fairly polite word. Frit. Fratelli Tutti answers the question, the radical question, the difficult question, the hard to believe answer question, how? And it says, and this is alarming because the challenge is so great, the only way is by being siblings. There's no other way. So that's the answer of how they connect. Who are we? We're an evangelizing church. What do we need to do? We need to care for our common home. Now the we, of course, gets broader and broader. And how? Fratelli Tutti.
Right over here.
Thank you, Your Eminence, for a very rich and thought-provoking analysis. Scott Alexander, I'm on the faculty at CTU. Would you agree, I know sort of continuity and reminding us of continuity in important church social teachings, for instance, is very important. But would you agree that in some ways, in these three great documents you've cited, there's an implicit critique of not only the anthropology, but the sociology of a document like Rerum Novarum, which, you know, in and of itself articulates a defense of capital and not just private ownership, as some of the words of the text suggest. And in a way that really couldn't, I don't think, foresee the problem of the what that you just so eloquently pointed out. And also, to me too, it seems like Fratelli Tutti is trying to call us to an approach to getting the anthropology right that's centered on the praxis of building transformative relationships, rather than thinking we've got it right and sort of going forward and trying to teach others through a certain concept of evangelization. I'm just wondering what you think about that perception, because that's been buzzing around in my head throughout your talk.
Yeah, well, I think maybe the key the key answer was in your question when you said praxis, in the sense that yes, we can do comparative readings of the encyclicals. It would be even better to do comparative readings of each encyclical in relationship to its context, with the other in its context, which already reduces much of the contrast that you were suggesting. But I think one of the things that Pope Francis teaches very consistently, without using these exact words, is that if you find yourself sort of worrying about and going back and forth about abstractions, you can go on if you like, but we're not going to get anywhere. Yeah. So in that sense, praxis is the right word or the right direction. If you have a question about how to go forward, well, try it. Look. Basically, he would say, look for a frontier, look for a periphery in your world, and pass it. And what? Well, if you go to a periphery, you'll find them. Don't worry.
Thank you kindly for your presentation this evening. My name is Michael Miller. I serve in Catholic healthcare, and part of my role is to help operate healthcare businesses as a ministry of the church. So the words that you were saying around the challenges of Homo economicus is a reality in my work every day. But I also know that in the Ministry of Healthcare, there's many stories of hope. And that helps me get through some of the economic struggle, of course. And I'm wondering if you could kindly share an example or two in your role in serving the church. Where can we look to for hope today?
One of the stories of hope that inspires me consistently is something I learned from the popular movements quite early in the time of Pope Francis, where I learned how people in Buenos Aires, which is an enormous metropolitan area, people whom we would call scavengers, using the word with all due respect. Scavengers, by working together in a non-capitalist, non-competitive way, have been able to generate a very efficient, a very environmentally friendly, and an economically viable industry of recycling. And what's very touching is to hear some of them say, I learned, they don't call it scavenging, but I learned the trade because my father took me with him when he went scavenging. And this child learned scavenging from her father. I don't think I can say anymore.
And I think we have one more. Nope.
Hi, my name is Carlos. This is more of a personal question about relationships. A lot of the people that I'm close with are actively working against a lot of the values that you just espoused. They're people that I love deeply, that I care about, but they, I'm going to create some generic examples, but they could be, for example, working for weapons manufacturers or pharmaceutical companies or private prisons. These are people that I'm sure people in this room have all relationships with. And I guess the question that I have is, how do we engage and substantively change people who are close to us, who are upholding some of these systems of economic injustice and oftentimes are themselves benefiting from it? How do we, because we can talk about doing these things at a macro policy, global scale, but when it comes down to, your brother, your cousin, and your best friend being a part of these institutions that cause so much suffering, how do you maintain relationships with them, love them as your sibling without, losing sight of what needs to change?
I've learned this directly from Pope Francis, so I give the answer with confidence. It's not at all clear that your vocation is to change them. And you shouldn't feel the burden, because you have friends like the people in this room, that you're somehow morally obliged to change these people, in order to hold up our end of the cause. So that's one good thing. Since you asked a personal question, I'll give a personal answer. Put that away. That's not your problem. It's not your calling. I'm 1,000% sure. But instead of this interpersonal homily, I'll give you a more general answer, which is to adapt the great saying of the first Francis of Assisi, who encouraged his friars, his followers, to do everything they could to preach the gospel, and, if necessary, use words. Only if necessary, use words. So, I don't think you should worry about your relatives or your friends, but you should worry about the poor. So do what you need to do what you're called to do, go to your peripheries, and leave the rest to the Holy Spirit. It's very, very good at this. And you don't need to know it either. That's the other poverty that you need to give up. You don't need them to come to you and say, "Oh, George, I'm so glad I finally see the light." You can renounce that satisfaction forever, or at least until the next life. And in the meanwhile, do damage by doing what you need to do.
So on behalf of Catholic Theological Union, I'd like to thank all of you for coming out here and joining us for this event tonight. As an expression of our gratitude, there are some refreshments waiting out in the lobby outside this room. We hope you'll join us and continue the conversation with one another, and please do come back. But before I let him find his way to the seat that I can tell he so dearly wants to take, let me ask you to join me in not only thanking Cardinal Czerny for his presence with us here tonight and his remarkable message that he's brought with us, but join me also in expressing to him our support for his ministry and the ministry of Pope Francis, which we hope you will take back with